Story 1. The road to the farmhouse was shrouded in mist, the kind that clung to the air and made you feel like you were driving through a dream. Or a nightmare. The old Ford creaked as I turned onto the gravel path, its headlights barely piercing the gloom. My heart pounded, a sensation that felt foreign in my chest. I was Father Paul, after all. A man of faith, a shepherd of souls. But tonight, doubt gnawed at the edges of my conviction. The farmhouse appeared suddenly, looming out of the fog like a ghost. Its windows were dark, and the porch light flickered, casting eerie shadows across the peeling paint. As I stepped out of the car, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hoot of an owl. I hesitated, clutching my Bible and rosary, then forced myself forward. I had been called here for a reason, and I had a duty to fulfill. "Father Paul," a voice called out from the shadows. I turned to see Mrs. Harper, the girl's mother, emerging from the darkness. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. She looked older than I remembered, worn down by the weight of whatever had taken hold of her daughter. "Thank you for coming, Father," she said, her voice trembling. "She's been different lately. Talking to things that aren't there, knowing things she shouldn't." "Where is she?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "In her room. She hasn't left it in days." I followed her into the house, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The air was thick with a musty smell, mingling with the scent of something rotten, like meat left out too long. Mrs. Harper led me to the second floor, to a door at the end of the hall. She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and looked at me with a desperation that made my skin crawl. "Father, please help her," she whispered, before opening the door. The room was dark, lit only by a single candle on the nightstand. In the flickering light, I saw her. Emily. She sat on the bed, her back to me, humming softly to herself. She looked like any other 10-year-old, but there was something off about her, something I couldn't quite place. "Emily," I called out gently. She turned to face me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Her eyes were wide, too wide, and her smile was unnervingly serene. But it was her gaze that unnerved me most. It was as if she could see straight into my soul, stripping away my defenses. "Father Paul," she said in a sing-song voice, "I've been waiting for you." "Emily, I'm here to help," I said, trying to sound calm. "Your mother is worried about you." "Mommy worries too much," she replied, her voice light and airy. "She doesn't understand." "Understand what?" "That I know things, Father. Things about you." A knot formed in my stomach. "What do you mean, Emily?" She giggled, a sound that made my blood run cold. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? A good priest helping others, doing God's work. But I know your secrets." My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't told anyone about my past, about the doubts that plagued me, about the sins I had committed before taking my vows. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "You remember Sarah, don't you? The girl you loved before you became a priest. The one you left behind." I froze, the memory crashing into me like a tidal wave. Sarah, with her bright smile and soft laughter, the woman I had abandoned when I chose the priesthood. I had tried to bury that part of my life, to forget her, but the guilt had never truly left me. "How do you know about Sarah?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know everything, Father. I know how you still think about her, how you regret choosing God over her. I know how you cry at night, begging for forgiveness. But no one's listening, Father. Not even him." My hands trembled as I clutched my Bible tighter. This wasn't just a child speaking. Something else was inside her, something dark and malevolent. Emily, you need to let go of these thoughts. They're not yours. Not mine. She laughed, a harsh grating sound. These thoughts are all yours, Father. You can't hide from them anymore. I felt a surge of panic. This was no ordinary case of possession. The demon, if that's what it was using my own fears against me, breaking me down from the inside. I couldn't let it win. By the power of Christ, I command you to leave this child. I shouted, raising the crucifix in front of me. Emily recoiled, hissing like a cornered animal. For a moment her eyes flickered, as if something else was looking out through them, something ancient and hungry. Your faith is weak, Father, she snarled. You can't save her. You can't even save yourself. Get behind me, Satan. I shouted, louder this time. The air crackled with tension, and I could feel the presence of something evil, something that wanted to devour me whole. Suddenly, Emily lunged at me, her small hands clawing at my face. I staggered back, shocked by her strength. She tore the crucifix from my hand, flinging it across the room. I struggled to hold her off, but she was like a wild animal, thrashing and screaming. Let go of her, you fiend! I yelled, trying to restrain her. But she twisted out of my grasp and bolted toward the door. Emily, stop! I cried, but she was already gone, disappearing into the night. I stumbled after her, out of the house and into the cold, damp air. The fog swallowed everything, and I could barely see a few feet ahead. I heard her laughter echoing through the trees, mocking and cruel. Desperation clawed at me as I chased her through the forest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches whipped against my face, and the ground was treacherous underfoot. I could hear her ahead of me, her laughter growing fainter, leading me deeper into the darkness. Then silence. I stopped, panting, straining to hear anything. But there was nothing. No laughter, no footsteps, only the oppressive stillness of the forest. Emily! I called out, my voice cracking. But there was no answer. I stood there, alone in the darkness, the weight of my failure pressing down on me. I had lost her. Worse, I had failed in my duty as a priest. The doubts that had plagued me for so long now consumed me. What kind of man was I to falter in the face of evil? How could I continue to serve when I couldn't even save one soul? The fog thickened around me, and I dropped to my knees, feeling utterly lost. For the first time since taking my vows, I questioned everything. My faith, my purpose, my very existence. How could I go on, knowing I had been so utterly defeated? As I knelt there, surrounded by the darkness, a single thought gnawed at me, relentless and cruel. Maybe I wasn't meant to be a priest after all. Story 2. When the call came in from St. Ignatius Parish, I nearly laughed out loud. They wanted me, an atheist with a small production company, to film an exorcism. For educational purposes, they said. Future exorcists would study it. I should have turned it down right then, but business had been slow, and money is money, even if it comes from the church. So here I was, pulling up to the Marshall family's house, a dilapidated Victorian on the outskirts of town. The place looked like it hadn't seen a paintbrush in decades, with weeds choking the front yard and shutters hanging on for dear life. As I parked my van, I couldn't help but smirk. The perfect setting for this farce. Mr. Becker. A voice called out as I stepped out of the van. I turned to see a man in his late 40s approaching, his face etched with worry. That's me. David Becker, I replied, extending a hand. Thank you for coming, he said, shaking my hand firmly. I'm Mark Marshall. He looked haggard, like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes red-rimmed. I appreciate you doing this. I know it must seem strange. Strange is one way to put it, I said with a chuckle. But hey, I'm just here to do my job. He nodded, but there was no humor in his expression. Let me show you to Rebecca's room. Inside, the house was dark and musty, with an air of abandonment despite being lived in. Mark led me up a creaky staircase to the second floor, stopping outside a door at the end of the hall. He paused, his hand on the knob, as if gathering the strength to open it. Rebecca was fine until about 6 months ago, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. One day she just shut down. No doctor could explain it. They all say she's in a vegetative state, but there's something else, something they don't understand. I felt a twinge of pity for the guy. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Marshall. He gave me a sad smile. Please call me Mark. Mark pushed the door open, and I followed him into the room. The smell hit me first. An acrid mix of sweat and something metallic, like rusted iron. The room was dim, with heavy curtains blocking out most of the daylight. In the center of the room was a bed, and on it lay Rebecca Marshall. She was barely recognizable as a living person. Her skin was pale and waxy, stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were open, staring vacantly at the ceiling, unblinking. I could see the rise and fall of her chest, but it was so shallow that if I hadn't been watching closely, I might have missed it. Christ, I muttered under my breath. She's really out of it. She hasn't moved or spoken in 6 months, Mark said quietly. Not since it happened. What happened? He hesitated, then shook his head. I don't know. I just found her like this. I didn't press further. Instead, I set to work, unpacking my gear and setting up the cameras. I placed one at each corner of the room, ensuring every angle was covered. I wanted to capture the entire spectacle, no matter where the action took place. The last camera I set up was focused directly on Rebecca. As I worked, 2 men entered the room, both dressed in black clerical attire. The priests. The elder of the two, a gray-haired man with a severe expression, introduced himself as Father Michael. The younger one, Father Andrew, was fresh-faced and looked like he was straight out of seminary. Mr. Becker, Father Michael said, nodding to me. Thank you for your assistance today. Just doing my job, I replied, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. They began to prepare, laying out their tools. Holy water, a crucifix, and a worn leather-bound Bible. I busied myself checking the camera feeds on my monitor, making sure everything was in focus. I glanced at the screen showing Rebecca, but nothing had changed. She lay there motionless, her eyes still fixed on the ceiling. We're ready to begin, Father Michael announced. I gave them a thumbs up, signaling I was rolling. Father Michael stood at the foot of the bed, raising the crucifix, while Father Andrew hovered nearby, clutching the Bible. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, Father Michael intoned, his voice steady. We gather here to cleanse this woman of any evil spirits that may have taken hold of her. We command you, unclean spirits, to leave this vessel. I leaned back in my chair, stifling a yawn. This was going to be a long day. As the prayers droned on, I found myself zoning out. But then something caught my eye on the monitor. At first, I thought it was a glitch. One of the cameras flickered, the feed briefly distorting. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Then it happened again, but this time it wasn't just a flicker. Shapes. Dark, writhing shapes like shadows, but with form and substance. They moved along the walls, creeping closer to Rebecca's bed. I blinked, certain I was seeing things, but when I looked again, they were still there. What the hell? I muttered. I glanced up at the priests, but they were still deep in prayer, oblivious to what I was seeing. My eyes darted back to the monitor. The shadows were clearer now, more defined. They looked like figures, hunched and twisted, with long spindly limbs. 3 of them, circling the bed like predators sizing up prey. My heart began to race. I knew what I was seeing couldn't be real. Demons weren't real. Possession wasn't real. But there they were on my screen, plain as day. One of the shapes moved closer to Rebecca, hovering over her like a dark cloud. I watched in horror as her body twitched. Just a small movement, barely noticeable, but after 6 months of complete stillness, it was like a jolt of electricity. "Father Michael." I blurted out, unable to keep quiet. The priest stopped and looked at me, confused. "What is it?" Father Michael asked. "There's something." I pointed to the monitor, but the words caught in my throat. The shadows were gone. The room looked exactly as it had before. Father Michael frowned, then turned back to Rebecca. "Focus on the task at hand, Mr. Becker." I stared at the monitor, my pulse thundering in my ears. Had I imagined it? Was it just a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The priests resumed the exorcism, their voices rising in intensity. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, half expecting the shadows to return. And then, as Father Michael sprinkled holy water on Rebecca, it happened again. The shadows erupted from the walls, swirling around the room like a storm. The camera feeds flickered, distorted by the sheer presence of these things. This time, there was no mistaking it. These were demons. And they were real. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. The room felt colder, the air thick with malevolence. On the screen, I saw Rebecca's eyes roll back, her body convulsing violently. The demons were on her, pressing down, their forms shifting and writhing. "Father, stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking with panic. But it was too late. Rebecca's mouth opened in a silent scream, and her body arched off the bed. The lights in the room flickered, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. A sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I scrambled for the door, driven by a primal fear I'd never felt before. As I bolted down the stairs, the last thing I heard was Father Michael shouting prayers over the chaos. The camera feeds went dark, and then there was nothing but silence. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gulping in fresh air as if I'd been suffocating. My van was still parked in the driveway, a mocking reminder of how foolish I'd been. I had come here as a skeptic, a man of logic, but what I had seen, there was no explanation for it. Story 3. Detective Lieutenant James Carter sat across from me, his eyes hard as stone. The dim light of the interrogation room cast deep shadows on his face, emphasizing every line of weariness etched into his features. He'd been grilling me for over an hour, and his patience was clearly wearing thin. "Let's cut the crap, Father," he growled, leaning forward. "You're here because a girl is dead. A 17-year-old girl. I want answers, and I want them now." I nodded, keeping my gaze low, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was a small man, unassuming, with thinning hair and glasses that perpetually slid down my nose. People often mistook my meekness for weakness, but I knew better. "Of course, Detective. I'll tell you everything." "You'd better," he snapped, "because I'm not in the mood for any priestly mumbo-jumbo." "I understand," I replied softly. "This isn't easy for me, either." Carter scoffed. "I bet. Start from the beginning. How did you get involved with the Millers?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the retelling. It was about 3 months ago. Mr. and Mrs. Miller came to me in a state of utter desperation. Their daughter, Emily, had been showing signs of severe psychological distress. Hallucinations, violent outbursts, speaking in languages she had no way of knowing. They'd exhausted every medical option. Doctors, psychiatrists, specialists, none of them could help. Carter crossed his arms, clearly unimpressed. And that's when they decided to call in a priest. Instead of, say, a mental hospital? They were devout Catholics, I explained. They believed that what was happening to Emily wasn't natural, that it was something darker. Of course they did, Carter muttered. So you just jumped in, ready to perform an exorcism? Not immediately, I corrected. There's a process, you see. The church is very cautious about these matters. We don't rush into exorcisms lightly. First, I had to conduct an investigation. An investigation? Carter raised an eyebrow. Yes, I continued. I met with Emily several times, observing her behavior, looking for signs that might suggest a spiritual affliction rather than a purely psychological one. I kept a detailed record of everything. The way she spoke, the changes in her voice, the physical manifestations. Physical manifestations, he repeated, his skepticism palpable. Yes. Objects moving on their own, strange smells, an aversion to sacred items. I paused, recalling the chilling experiences. In one session, she spoke in Aramaic, a language she had never studied, never even heard. The voice wasn't hers, detective. It was something else entirely. Convenient, Carter said flatly. So, you sent your report to the church, and they just gave you the green light? Not exactly. The church is very thorough. My report was reviewed by a panel of theologians and psychologists, and only after their approval did the bishop authorize the exorcism. Must have been a lot of red tape. It was necessary, I replied. We wanted to be absolutely certain. Carter leaned back in his chair, scrutinizing me. All right, let's get to the part that really matters. The exorcism. What happened? My hands trembled slightly as I recalled that night. The ritual was performed in the Miller's home. Emily was restrained for her safety. She had become violent in the days leading up to the exorcism. Her parents were present, praying quietly in the next room. And you were the one performing it. Yes, I said quietly. Father Joseph, a more experienced exorcist, assisted me. We began with the prayers of deliverance, calling upon God to protect us and to cast out the demon that we believed had taken hold of Emily. Carter narrowed his eyes. And? I swallowed hard, the memory still raw. It started slowly. Emily screamed, writhed, cursed us in voices that weren't hers. We pressed on, reciting the prayers, commanding the entity to leave. But it resisted, lashing out, mocking us, threatening us. Threatening you how? With secrets, detective, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. It knew things about me, things I had never told anyone. My doubts, my sins, my deepest fears. It taunted me with them, tried to break my resolve. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in Carter's eyes. You're saying this demon or whatever got into your head? Yes. It was a battle of wills, and it was relentless. But you kept going. I had to, I said, my voice trembling. For Emily's sake. We couldn't let it win. And then we reached the climax of the rite. Emily's body convulsed violently, and for a moment I thought we were winning. But then something went wrong. What? Carter demanded, leaning forward. Emily, she became deathly still, her eyes rolled back, and then she laughed. A cold, empty laugh. The kind that chills you to your core. I knew in that moment we had failed. The demon was still inside her, stronger than ever. And then, without warning, Emily broke free from her restraints. She grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor and... My voice cracked, tears welling in my eyes. She killed herself, Carter finished for me, his tone harsh. Right in front of you. I nodded, unable to speak. Carter stared at me, his expression unreadable. And you expect me to believe this? It's the truth, detective, I whispered. Truth? He laughed bitterly. A 17-year-old girl is dead because of you. Because you filled her head with this nonsense about demons. I didn't argue. How could I? He was right, in a way. I had failed her. So now what? Carter pressed. You think saying a few Hail Marys is going to fix this? I looked up at him, my eyes brimming with tears. No, detective. There's no fixing this. What's done is done. Carter shook his head in disgust. You priests are all the same. Hiding behind your faith, your rituals, while people suffer. You're right, I said softly. I failed her. I failed everyone. Carter sighed, rubbing his temples. This is a waste of time. I'm done here. As he stood to leave, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I looked up at him, and for the first time, I smiled. You should leave, detective, I said, my voice suddenly steady. Before it's too late. Carter paused, frowning. What are you talking about? I stood slowly, feeling a cold, dark power surging within me. You see, detective, the demon didn't leave that night. It just found a new host. His eyes widened in realization, but it was too late. Before he could reach for his gun, I lunged at him, my hands closing around his throat with inhuman strength. He struggled, gasping for air, his eyes bulging with terror. Father. William, he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. But it wasn't Father William anymore. It hadn't been since that night. With a final brutal squeeze, I silenced him forever. The room fell into a heavy silence, the air thick with the scent of death. I looked down at the lifeless body, a cold smile spreading across my face.